Good evening. It's really a pleasure to be here. And what I'd like to start out with is kind of give you where we're headed. And that is there's some interesting technology that's actually quite old, originated in Japan and 50 years ago, but recently has gained traction in the United States. And I'll take you a little bit through a journey that I've had where I've first gone to Japan to study under the experts, but a couple years ago we had some ideas of how to build a better mousetrap, and so my partner and I, Sean Whalen, who's actually in the entryway. He and I have put our heads together and developed a blood flow restriction product that we think solves a lot of the problems that were existing. So now let's get into a little bit of the mechanism, because it's not quite straightforward. But obviously with blood flow restriction training, we want to restrict blood flow, but we want to do it in a specific way. What we want to do is, at rest, we want to block the veins from blood getting out of the extremity. But if you just block the veins and then let things go their way, first a limb would engorge or distend with blood that's coming in from the artery and nothing's getting out. And if that went on long enough, the artery would stop because there's no more room to put anything in. So then what we have is this muscle contraction. So when you do a muscle contraction, you're actually squeezing the blood in the muscle, and you're sending it somewhere. And because of the valve system in the veins, where it goes is it overflows the venous blockade, and you end up changing the character of the venous flow from what I kind of call a lazy river, where it's kind of continuous, to one in which it's blocked for a period of time, and then with muscle contraction, all of a sudden, all this blood is pushed out of the extremity, and so you actually get almost pulsatile venous flows going from 0 to very high rates. And this actually is preventative for any kind of clot formation, because what you're doing is you're flushing this thing out repeatedly and keeping the thing moving. But in many ways, what we've done is we've just slowed down and inhibited the blood flow, so that when we have this situation, the exercising muscle is not going to get the blood it normally gets, nor needs to continue contractions. This is the bit again about what we do is we actually, by putting these bands on, we don't really change resting flows. But normally when you go from rest to exercise, the arterial inflow picks up. And we're really preventing that increase from happening. And then to all said and done, these vascular changes result in an angiogenic stimulus, building more and better blood vessels. And I'll show you some data later on that kind of indicates this. So the working muscle, the bottom line is the working muscle is denied the blood flow it normally needs to sustain these contractions. So what happens in this muscle? Now, this is where the disturbance of homeostasis takes place. And I'll show you some information about the amount of oxygen in the muscle goes down, the pH, or the amount of the pH goes down, the amount of acidity goes up, and the intracellular phosphate stores are depleted. In addition, the lactic acid is increased, as well as inorganic phosphate, which is a breakdown product from these intracellular phosphates. Taken together, these changes produce a metabolic crisis, which has several main consequences. As these early motor units fatigue, faster and bigger units must take over the work, eventually leading to recruitment of all muscle fibers in a muscle. And this is actually important because generally you can divide the world into type 1 fibers and type 2 fibers, or slow twitch and fast twitch. And normally when we're doing everyday activities, we're relying on our slow twitch muscle. And those fibers being activated are very dependent on the blood supply, and you go along, you're a happy camper, and you're able to do work. But if you're doing intense exercise or heavy weightlifting or long duration things like marathons, you end up needing to tap into these faster twitch fibers. And the only way that those fibers get trained is by having contractions. So when you're thinking of explosive sports or very, very big strength-oriented tasks, you need to use all the fibers in the muscle to do this. And so it's very hard to recruit these. But we found a way by restricting the blood flow that we start having these faster and bigger units have to take over the work because the easy ones or the early ones have dropped out. And so this leads to total recruitment of all fibers of the muscle. Also, this disturbance of homeostasis stimulates local protein synthesis in an attempt to repair the damage that's being done. And in addition, the cell surface, anabolic cell surface receptors are upregulated so that now this muscle fiber has these little catcher's mitts on its surface looking for anabolic hormones to come by and activate even more protein synthesis. In addition, this signal of distress is sent to the CNS versus a kind of afferent nerve fibers called group 3 and group 4. So we'll get into a little bit of this here. This is a technique called near-infrared spectroscopy. For those of you who have been in a hospital setting and somebody has put a little pulse oximeter on your finger to see that you're saturated with oxygen on the arterial side, here, this is the same sort of thing, but instead of looking at moving blood, this is looking at hemoglobin that is in the muscle itself. So these numbers give you an idea of what's called SMO2, or the saturation of oxygen in the muscle, so in a percent thing. And so here we have just regular exercise, doing arm curls, and normal levels of oxygen in muscle at rest are about, let's say, 65%. And then you start doing exercise, and it drops down in the mid-30s. And then you stop and rest a little bit, it comes back up. And this kind of goes back and forth here, but you kind of see the baseline. As you get warmed up, you actually don't go down as far, and when you recover, you're going up even higher. And then when you really stop, you've got this recovery hyperemia where you have very high levels of oxygen in the muscle. If you do that with blood flow restriction bands on, we're starting out more or less in the same place again, and then you just put the pressure into the band, and all of a sudden it's dropped the oxygen without any exercise. And here we continue on with some of the exercise, and now instead of in the mid-30s, we're in the mid-20s. We continue to increase the pressure, and the muscle gets worse and worse, and before you know it, we're really down in the basement. This is extreme hypoxia, which is a very good stimulus for, number one, causing a disturbance of homeostasis, and number two, stimulating protein synthesis. This is some other data from nuclear magnetic spectroscopy and identifying this sort of thing. If you look over here, these are spectra that go from without any kind of blood flow restriction from rest to exercise. And what you see is that inorganic phosphate peak is increased from rest to exercise, and the phosphocreatine peak is severely reduced, indicating this kind of use of phosphate in the muscle, or the ATP. And these are the curves for ATP, and they're down a little bit as well after exercise. But then if you restrict the blood flow to this muscle, now all of a sudden the inorganic phosphate peak is much higher, and the remaining phosphocreatine is much lower than the comparable thing where blood flow is going on, and you still have the ATP curves showing degeneration. So between the last slide and this one, this shows that muscle with blood flow restriction training gets very hypoxic and basically runs out of its energy stores. Now, so this gets back to what the consequences of those kind of things. So when the PO2 gets to a certain point and when the energy stores empty out, then those muscle fibers that are working, they just stop. They fail. They can't do it anymore. And that is the typical kind of thing that you see over here. These are arm curls, tricep extensions. But then as these fibers drop out, you start recruiting faster and faster and faster fibers, still using the same easy weights. And before you know it, you're getting into the same fiber populations that you're using with very explosive, powerful movements. Kind of depicting this thing in another way, the typical way for recruitment and fatigue pattern is if you use light weights or you increase the weight and increase the weight, you get more and more of these fibers contracting until you need to use very heavy weights and near maximal weights to contract all of the fibers in the muscle. Blood flow restriction recruitment and fatigue pattern is such where the weight stays the same, but because we have restricted the blood flow, now these early fibers, they start to drop out and you recruit faster and faster fibers, and before you know it, with light weights, you're recruiting the same percentage of fibers in the muscle that you are with really heavy weights. And this is actually one of the big take-home points, that essentially we can become trained with very light weights and blood flow restriction to the same extent that you can with heavy weights. So this is a little bit more of the mechanism. This is the mTOR pathway. The thing to point out here is that the reduction in energy stores and the reduction in oxygen or hypoxia are very strong stimuli in this pathway to activate the mTOR pathway that ends up resulting in protein synthesis. In addition, these self-surface receptors are activated and upregulated, so they're looking for growth factors to come along and amplify the process. So, what we really have, the next aspect of this, and by the way, the point of showing this slide is that our bands go anywhere and can be used anytime. She's actually doing handstand push-ups, which is quite remarkable. And on top of that, she's 57 years old. She happens to be my wife, but... So there's something called a systemic neuroimmunohormonal response or an anabolic response, and by triggering this disturbance of homeostasis message is sent up to the brain, and the brain then releases this systemic response. And there's autonomic hormones and anabolic hormones that end up then going throughout the body, and that will be important in some of the data that I show a little later. So this systemic response amplifies these local responses to upregulate protein synthesis, and any muscles that we're exercising, whether their blood flow was restricted or not, adapt to this situation. Because little damage was done, there's an increase in strength and fitness very quickly. So what we have here is that this balance between breakdown and buildup is altered in favor of building up, and so the changes that occur happen readily and on a relatively quick time scale. So, for example, as few as 5 sessions of blood flow restriction training can end up prompting an increase in strength and fitness. So, again, I had stressed this earlier, all tissues that were involved in the exercise, whether they were proximal or distal to the blood flow restriction bands, enjoy this systemic anabolic action. So this is a kind of a cartoon that depicts this problem. So here's this muscle doing arm curls with a blood flow restriction band in place, and this disturbance of homeostasis is being communicated through metaboreceptors all the way up into the brain, rattles around up here for a while, and there comes out a sympathetic response that increases sweating, increases heart rate, increases breathing, and that's one thing. But in addition, there's a reflex that ends up through the hypothalamus and then into the pituitary, releasing a number of anabolic hormones, including growth hormone, that then again go throughout the body. And this basically shows this. And here we have, this is whole blood lactate, and the open squares are the control exercise, where it's just exercise alone. And then with the same exercise, but the blood flow restriction bands in place, you have a much more, or a highly significant increase in blood lactate. And lactate itself stimulates protein synthesis in the tissues that it's being generated. In addition, coming back to some of these vascular changes, here we see that VEGF, or vascular endothelial growth factor, is stimulated by the blood flow restriction training, which you see in the closed or filled-in circles here, compared to the control exercise itself. And these two things are basically local effects, or examples of the local effect that we were talking about earlier. But then now here we have the systemic effect. So here this is growth hormone, and the control exercise, or the same exercise, when there's no blood flow restriction bands in place, has this nice little gray line, and basically nothing's moving. And here, this is before the exercise, this is after the blood flow restriction training, and here you have at 10 minutes and at 30 minutes, very robust increases in growth hormone production. And this growth hormone then goes, among other places, to the liver, where it stimulates an increase in IGF-1, or insulin growth factor 1, which is also a very anabolic substrate. So taken together, here you have some indications of a local effect and also evidence of a systemic effect that is highly anabolic. So this is an article that came out in the Journal of Applied Physiology in the year 2000, and I want to kind of go through these graphs in detail. What we have here on the x-axis is basically the speed of the movement, and on the y-axis, the amount of torque generated. So, and where you have negative speeds, that's extension of the arm. Where you have positive speeds, it's flexion of the arm. And what you see here is if you take an untrained control group and you test them twice with 4 weeks in between, they basically have no change, and it's a very reproducible test. So now going on the other side of this is standard weight training. This is about using 80% of a 1 rep max. It's a bit of an artificial situation, but it's typical along with the kind of recommendations that we get for normal strength training. And here we have the pre-training values, and then what we see is at all speeds, there's a significant improvement in strength or torque generation with standard heavy lifting or high-intensity training. Then on the other hand, if we use low-intensity training, and instead of 80% of 1 rep of maximum, we use 30 to 40% of maximum. Here we have not much is happening. There's a little bit of an increase, but basically easy weight training really doesn't cut it in terms of improving strength. But if we add blood flow restriction to the same weights that were added here, now all of a sudden we have the same kind of advantages that we get with the heavy lifting. So you saw that graph where the Olympic lifter was kind of losing control of the weight. That kind of training compared to the stuff that 87-year-old guy was doing with a big exercise ball, you end up getting the same percent improvements in strength. This is an amazing finding, to be able to use very light training that's possible for particularly seniors, and to get these dramatic improvements in strength. Another study that recently came out showing essentially the same thing is, now this is with high school students, and they were doing back squats. And the conditions here are they had low intensity work, less than 30% of one repetition maximum, or heavy work, greater than 65% of 1 repetition maximum, or the combination of this kind of weight training plus BFR. And what you see here is that the low-intensity weight training with the BFR actually has a robust improvement in the amount of weight that they could move pre and post test, where light weights by themselves did nothing, and you had a good but not as good improvement in strength with the heavy weights by themselves. And this is consistent. This is the same kind of results that we got on that first slide that I showed you. And again, the reason for this probable difference, the reason it's even better, is because we're not doing damage to the tissue when we're working it out. And so you don't have to kind of repair the damage that was done before you can go on and do more. So not only that, here we have this on the x-axis here are days. And they were doing a BFR workout once a day. And what you see is compared to the same weights, light training alone, but light training with Katsu, there's an increase in the muscle bone cross-sectional area that is happening very rapidly. And so this is, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. By a week, they had actually gotten to significant gains compared to the control situation. So very quick thing. And that is also consistent with this idea that we're not doing the damage, so we don't have to repair the damage first and then get better. We're getting better right from the get-go. And here we have something else that is kind of unusual. This is where they're doing a bench press, one repetition maximum, and here's the percent change in strength. And this is basically lightweight training, and then this is the same training with the BFR. But what's interesting here is you use both your pecs and your triceps to do a bench press. The triceps have their blood flow restricted, but the pecs don't. They're well above the thing, and both of these muscles are showing improvements in strength and improvements in cross-sectional area. So here we have improvements in strength and in size of muscle from this. Muscle is attached to bone. And here we have, in a different study, they were studying leg press, and they had, with Katsu, they had a nice improvement in leg strength over control where there was really no change. And in thigh cross-sectional muscle, again, a nice significant improvement in thigh cross-sectional area of muscle compared to the control. But then also we have a significant improvement in bone-specific alkaline phosphatase. And this is an enzyme that's used in bone turnover. And when this is going up, it means that something's happening to the bone, and indicating that there's increased bone turnover and likely improved bone density as a result of this. Here's IGF-1. In this case, it's not statistically different, but still an increase. So now we have positive changes in muscle. We have positive changes in bone. And we have positive changes in building new and better blood vessels. What we have here is mRNA expression on this axis, and these are markers for vascular endothelial growth factor, its receptor, something called HIF-1 alpha, which is a hypoxyl inducible factor, and then various isoforms of the nitric oxide synthase system, which is also, all of these things are involved in building new blood vessels. And so what you have here is the open bars are with blood flow restriction training, and the black with the same kind of weights but no restriction. Another kind of neat study, and of all places coming out of Iran, but basically what they did is they took these poor little rats and they tied off their femoral arteries. Okay? And then they made them run on treadmills. And so this is their model for restrictive blood flow training. And what you see, this is an indication of muscle hypertrophy. What they did is they sacrificed the rats after a few sessions, and then they measured the ratio of the size of, in this case, the soleus muscle and the EDL, or extensor digitorum longus muscle. in these rats, and this sixth condition over here is treadmill walking or jogging on a little rat treadmill with the blood flow restriction conditions, where these things are various control situations. And this one over here, this third graph here, is just blood flow restriction alone without the treadmill walking. So, but here we have very significant results with a form of blood flow restriction training in these rats. And then also we have the receptor for the neurotransmission of the nicotinic acetylcholine receptor. And if you recall back on that slide where I was talking about what's happening to the motor nerves, this is indication that these receptors are coming back. And you're increasing the receptors with this form of blood flow restriction training. And I must say that when you tie off the femoral artery in a rat, it doesn't mean the whole thing dies. It just means that their blood flow is restricted. They're not able to get the normal amount of blood flow with exercise that they otherwise would. So this is in a rat model, and this is showing that the same kind of thing is happening in rats as to people. So now we've had a tremendous experience with this sort of stuff, and this is some of the different kinds of people that we're working with. This guy had a bad knee injury from playing soccer, and you can see here he's doing arm work, and it's hard to see here, but this is his right leg is in a stocking that he's using to keep down swelling in the injured side. This gentleman was in the Pentagon on September 11th, and he's also a Iraq and Afghanistan veteran, and he has post-traumatic stress syndrome, and he ends up claiming that this is the only way that he gets some of his relief. This guy has two things going on. One is at one point he had a PRP and stem cell ejection in his shoulder. He happens to be 81, and he also had a total knee replacement. And so this is a very good therapy for total joint replacement, as well as some of these things. This young man had low back pain, and he had an MRI that showed there's these discs bulging into his spine, and his orthopedic surgeon said, well, we should operate on this and we should take him out. In the meantime, he showed up at our clinic, and he ended up doing a Be Strong program, and then he was scheduled for surgery. He dutifully went down and was on the gurney, and he goes, wait a minute, doc, I don't think I need this anymore. And the guy goes, what are you talking about? And he says, well, here, look. And he got off the gurney, bends over and touches his toes, and says, my back's not hurting. And the surgeon says, get out of here. And so in literally the 2 weeks between the time he had his appointment with the orthopedic surgeon and the time that he was due to be operated on, we were able to take his pain away. This is an example of using 4 bands in training in a otherwise healthy young woman, and this young man had rotator cuff repair surgery, and again showing the same sorts of kind of things. So the theme here is that almost no matter what's wrong with you, we end up being able to address it with blood flow restriction training. These are actually 2 nurses. And this one happens to suffer from osteoarthritis, and this one from rheumatoid arthritis. Doing the Be Strong system got her out of the wheelchair. She has eliminated the pain that she normally has in her hands, and so it's effective for that kind of thing. And in addition, this kind of easy lifting or strength training is something that's possible for these women, where the normal kind of training that you might want to do to improve this kind of strength is just impossible to do. More of these cases. This guy's 83, and he had a shoulder repair. She's in her mid-50s, and same sort of thing. And you'll notice that In many of these cases, there's bands on both arms and legs at the same time. This guy had ankle surgery and was interested in getting his golf swing back, and we were able to allow him, where before with his foot he was in so much pain that he couldn't do anything, got operated on, and then to rehab him we ended up using these altered G treadmills in the back as well as the Be Strong, and now he's playing better than he ever has. Again, here's one of our guys doing more vigorous exercise with the bands on, and this is the total knee replacement, one of our total joint. This young lady had low back pain and ends up not having it anymore. He had a rotator cuff repair and a total knee replacement. So here's also some fascinating things. This is one of our women jumpers who had a fall and she had a fracture in her thoracic spine. She did not have any spinal cord damage at the time, but we were doing the Be Strong exercises that she could tolerate without having her fracture hurt, and she's now back to normal. This young man over here is in his mid-60s, and he had a cardiac arrhythmia. The long story ended up, he was taken to the cardiac surgery thing, and he had a median sternotomy where they opened up his chest to repair what was going on. And in addition, he has ankylosing spondylitis of the neck. And before he was doing the Be Strong stuff, and before he had his cardiac surgery, his head was bent over. He could not get his neck into this normal position. And we were able to, again, doing exercise gently that didn't disturb the healing tissues, we were able to bring him around. This guy in the middle was a complete quadriplegic, and he had suffered he was surfing and he ended up getting dumped on his head on the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, and he was for 2 years he was in a spinal cord injury rehab unit and unable to walk and everything else. And little by little, it wasn't a complete lesion, but we were able to bring him back. And with doing this, and I don't know if you saw this, but we take these things to absolute exhaustion and failure. And so he's really working it there. And we were able to get him back so that he's just walking as normal. So in addition, this stuff is good for any kind of exercise. It just amplifies the effect. Here is roller skiing on the treadmill again with all 4 bands on, cycling with leg bands on, and in this little video, this is swimming in the Pacific with the bands on. And these are Be Strong cuffs, that we don't want them to inhibit the normal technique that's being used, but they go anywhere in any kind of environment. Some more cases. Both these are cases of ACL repairs, and in this case, a professional goalkeeper for the New York City Football Club. And in this case over here, Ted Ligety is one of our Olympic gold medalists in skiing. This is doing these kind of easy exercises, and it's his left knee that had the ACL replaced, and this is 2 weeks after the surgery. And you can kind of see that his legs are about the same size. That's kind of unheard of. Same thing for Ted here. The character of this stuff is that these are very exhaustive exercise. This simulates his alpine skiing, where basically you're flying down these slopes on a very unstable surface, and you have to use a lot of muscles to do this. but you couldn't ask him to go alpine skiing right now because it would likely tear up his repair. But here we can take him to exhaustion in a protected way and get him back to doing this kind of stuff. So here we have one more of these things, and this is when it's used as a training device. She's not particularly hurt here, but we have a alpine ski simulator, and doing it with the band on just magnifies the difficulty of the work, and here she is bent over, exhausted. She's another one of our gold medalists.